Good afternoon, everyone. Here's an update on Ukraine for August 5th. At the end of the video, I'll show the receipt for the donation to Action Against Hunger. This week, we donated $50, so that's awesome, bringing our total to $3,374. So, going to Ukraine here, a leading Russian hypersonics expert has been arrested on suspicion of treason, and this is according to a report coming out of the Russian state-controlled TASS news agency. The head of the hypersonics laboratory at the Novosibirsk Institute of Theoretical and Applied Mechanics was arrested. He was cited for having potentially disparaging remarks against Russia, but it doesn't really go further into what exactly his arrest was for, what the treason was. There's such a broad definition of treason in Russia right now that it's not really reported on as to what the cause was. Last month, another physicist from the same organization died of pancreatic cancer shortly after being arrested on the suspicion of treason as well. That pancreatic cancer diagnosis was pushed forward by the Kremlin. So take that with a grain of salt, if you will. Vladimir Putin and Turkey's President Erdogan have begun talks in Russia in the Black Sea region of Sochi. Excuse me. If you remember, Sochi is where the Olympics took place a while back. They're supposed to be talking about Syria, continuing efforts to get grain moving. I don't think there's going to be any of the difficult talks on Ukraine. Turkey has signaled often that they are wanting to maintain relations after this war concludes. Russia has done the same. The big talks, though, were on the nuclear power plant that is being built in Turkey by Russian engineers and developers. So there's a relation there that really frustrates a lot in the West, especially Europe and the United States, because they just aren't on board. It's like countries like Turkey and Hungary are running somewhat counter to the efforts of the greater NATO/EU/American effort to isolate and shut down Russia's ability to continue fighting in Ukraine. Russia has banned investors from so-called unfriendly countries from selling shares in key energy projects, as well as banks, until the end of the year. This is in response to sanctions of the West. They're trying to counter-sanction. It was a decree signed by Putin and was published on Friday that immediately bans all investors from countries that support sanctions on Russia from selling their assets in production sharing agreements, PSAs. Banks, strategic entities, companies that produce energy equipment, as well as other projects in the oil and gas market from being able to sell their assets. So while this strategy helps Putin in the short term, it all but guarantees that no one going forward will want to invest in Russia. Basically, if you want to invest in Russia going forward, you're very foolish because your investment is not safe. It's not guaranteed. You're not guaranteed to get a return or your investment back at all because Russia wants to seize and change the rules for their own ends. And that's something investors are going to shy away from going forward. Going to the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, the Russian occupation administration in Kherson is suffering from some staff shortages, apparently, because Ukrainians are reluctant to collaborate with them. Obviously, they're invading their country. For that reason, Russia is largely using administrative resources and logistics capabilities from the already occupied Crimea. So they're doing some sort of distributed leadership system. They're exploiting school teachers as well from occupied Crimea and forcing them to move to Kherson to implement their policies of Russification on Ukrainian children in Kherson schools. Many Ukrainian teachers were dismissed because they refused to undergo the retraining and collaborate with Russia. Russian journalists from occupied Crimea have been used by the Russians in Kherson to bolster media coverage as a liberation rather than just an invasion of an outsider. They're liberating them from the Ukrainians. But this liberation looks something like this. 408 Ukrainians living in the Kherson region have either been kidnapped or gone missing. Now, 259 have been released, but 149 of them are still being held captive without charges or trials. Many of those that are released are talking about the tortures they suffered while in Russian captivity. Additionally, on top of that, another 148 Ukrainians have been imprisoned for political reasons by Russian occupiers, and being sent to Crimea. 105 of them are representative of the indigenous people of Crimea. These are those Crimean Tatars who have been specifically targeted over and over again by by Russian forces since 2014. Russia is resorting to these filtration camps, and the people who go through them undergo interrogations, body examinations, to include absolutely unnecessary and humiliating searches of their genitals, etc. Many of these people, including children, are disappearing during the filtration process, and their fate is largely unknown. And because there's no exact numbers on how many have gone through, it's difficult for them to bring them back and habitate them back to Ukraine, so that they can go home. The Russian occupiers are forcibly displacing Ukrainians from newly occupied regions of Ukrainian territory into Russia, not just displacing them across Ukraine or into Crimea, but into Russia as well. And I've talked about this before. Again, the exact number of how many have had this happen to them is unknown. And these displaced Ukrainians are probably going to find it difficult to return back to Ukraine. The occupation administration is issuing Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens. Now, people will sit there and go, well, why not just not take it? Why say you have a choice? Why not just say, I don't want a Russian passport? Well, unfortunately, it's a matter of survival for Ukrainians, as those who refuse are deprived of humanitarian aid because the Russians are in control of the humanitarian aid. So in order to receive aid, you have to show that you have a Russian passport now, which is their way of forcing Ukrainians to get a Russian passport. And there's a referendum that they're looking to have in Kherson in September. And what they're trying to do is make it seem legitimate to the international community that these people wanted to be liberated by the Russians. Largely, most of the intelligent countries around the world will see it as a reflection of the Kremlin's wishes rather than whatever the actual vote tally is. It's going to be propaganda. They'll use the results, quote unquote, to convince usually their partner countries such as China and partner countries in the UN that their invasion was legitimate, not that they needed any convincing. Those people that need to get the Russian passports are also concerned that because you have a Russian passport, you're now a Russian citizen, meaning you can be mobilized in the Russian army. And if you refuse, you can be jailed or executed, because that's what Russia does. Now, Russia hopes that it will retain the control over Kherson, and the West, like we did in Crimea, will sooner or later just accept it. We'll just kind of go, all right, whatever, because there's just no strategic interest of Ukraine in the United States. And let's be honest, Europe is helping for sure, but the biggest power that is pushing money and equipment and intelligence is the United States. And Russia's just hoping that it'll become a business as usual situation as it did after the occupation of Crimea. Now, there's been some 100 anti-war actions in Crimea and additional ones in Kherson, where Molotov cocktails were being thrown, beatings, damaging private cars with the Z symbol, people who are doing small efforts like getting manicures with the Ukrainian flag, other areas of support that are both small and large. There is a resistance movement in Kherson that is organizing, and they've been attacking Russian troops, blowing up cars, and spreading pro-Ukrainian leaflets around. Meanwhile, the organization I've never been a huge fan of, Amnesty International, is claiming that Ukraine is the cause of Ukrainian civilians being put in harm's way. Not Russia, Ukraine is. Basically, they're just saying capitulate to the Russian effort, and President Zelensky came out and said that's absolute bullshit, and not in those terms, in his more presidential terms. But that's what's going on right now on the ground from a humanitarian standpoint in these Russian-occupied territories. It's torture, it's kidnap, it's re-education, it's concentration camps. It's all very bad. So that's what's going on in Ukraine, and here's the receipt for the donation to Action Against Hunger. Have a good day, everyone.